welcome to the special edition of Vantage from Bari. Soldiers on the streets, helicopters buzzing above us, frenzy at the media center. All of this means just one thing. The G7 summit is officially underway. World leaders are here, and for the next 2 days, they will discuss everything from Ukraine to Gaza to China and even artificial intelligence. We'll tell you what's on the agenda, including what the world leaders will eat. Meanwhile, here in Bari, residents are divided over the war in Ukraine because of a gift from Vladimir Putin. Also, why are Russian warships in Cuba? Is the Brics challenging the G7? Why has Pakistan hiked its defense budget again, even as its economy struggles? And what is the NEET controversy that is making headlines in India? Also, a special report on a Bitcoin ATM here in Bari, 2 of them in fact. All of this coming up ahead on the show, but first, the headlines.
The UK follows the US, announces new sanctions on Russia. These curbs target Moscow's main stock exchange. It comes a day after Washington announced similar measures. Russia's main stock market suspends dollar and euro trades following these sanctions. Swiss government hit by cyber attack ahead of the Ukraine peace summit. The attack made several websites unavailable by flooding them with malicious traffic. It resulted in minor outages as well. This weekend, Switzerland will host the first summit on peace in Ukraine. The European Union's top court fines Hungary over $200 million. It also imposes a daily $1 million penalty on Budapest for not following the bloc's asylum laws and illegally deporting migrants. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban calls EU's decision unacceptable. In India, Ajit Doval has been reappointed as the National Security Advisor. He will be assigned the rank of a cabinet minister. Doval is a former director of the Intelligence Bureau. He is one of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's most trusted aides and has been the National Security Advisor since 2014. And Lionel Messi will miss the upcoming Paris Olympics. However, Messi, who turns 37 later this month, has not closed the door on taking part in the 2026 World Cup. It will be a record-breaking 6th World Cup for the 8-time Ballon d'Or winner.
We are in Italy to cover the G7 summit, but we've been tracking the developments in Kuwait too. The tragedy that took the lives of 49 workers. 40 of them were Indians. They were killed in a deadly fire. They were employed by a private company, mostly to do odd jobs. More than 50 others have suffered injuries and are in hospital. We have some pictures from the aftermath of the tragedy, but before showing them, we would like to advise viewer discretion. These images are disturbing. That's the building which caught fire. It is near Kuwait's capital, Kuwait City. More than 200 workers were crammed into this 6-story building. They came from different parts of the world: Pakistan, the Philippines, Egypt and Nepal. But a majority of them came from India. Yesterday morning around 4:30 a.m. local time, the building caught fire. Most people inside were sleeping at the time. So they were there, trapped in the fire, and died due to suffocation. Some of the bodies have been charred beyond recognition. This is one of the worst fire tragedies in Kuwait's history. And it has led to a swift response from New Delhi. Last evening, Prime Minister Narendra Modi was briefed about what happened. He released a statement on social media. Prime Minister Modi said that he was saddened by the incident. He directed Kirti Vardhan Singh to leave for Kuwait. That's India's new Minister of State for External Affairs.
DNA test is underway to identify the victims, and as soon as the bodies are identified, their kin will be informed, and our Air Force plane will bring the bodies back.
New Delhi has opened hotlines for the family members of the victims. India is also speaking to local officials in Kuwait to repatriate the mortal remains of the victims. The government of India will compensate their families, but it should not end there. India must ensure that this is not repeated, and for that it must insist on better treatment of its workers overseas, especially those living in the Gulf, because this incident has once again cast a spotlight on their terrible living conditions. Many of them travel to the region for work and are engaged in odd jobs. They work as masons, carpenters, drivers and domestic workers. They lack protections from exploitation and abuse. The Indians who died in Kuwait could have been protected. The early findings of investigators point towards negligence. Workers were crammed in tiny spaces and fire safety norms were clearly ignored. The fire probably started in a kitchen on one of the lower floors, and then it spread rapidly. One of the reasons for that could be this. Some partitions were built inside the apartments to accommodate as many workers as possible. Highly inflammable material was used to build these partitions, and this may have helped the fire spread quickly. By the time the workers realized what was happening, the entire building was on fire. They tried to escape, but they couldn't. Going down the stairs was not an option. The fire had spread everywhere. Some workers tried to exit, but they died of suffocation. Others tried going to the rooftop, but could not because the door was locked. So they were trapped inside a burning building. It was a desperate situation. An eyewitness shared the story of a man who tried to save himself by jumping from the 5th floor. He died after hitting the corner of a balcony. Like I said, a very tragic turn of events. Kuwait's leadership is promising tough measures. Sheikh Fahad Yusuf Al-Sabah has spoken. He is Kuwait's Deputy Prime Minister and Interior Minister. He has blamed the owners of this building for the tragedy, accusing them of being greedy. So Kuwait is promising swift action. But what about the others? There are Indian workers across the region living in similar conditions. There are growing complaints about them being exploited. From 2019 to 2023, Indian embassies in the Gulf received more than 48,000 complaints. 48,000. These were made by Indian workers in countries like Bahrain, Oman, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which means that Indian embassies received at least one complaint by these workers every day for years. They were about abusive behavior of the employers, violation of workers' rights and poor living and working conditions. India sends the largest number of migrant workers overseas. By 2020, some 18 million Indians were living abroad, and the Gulf is a top destination for them. By 2022, 9 million Indians were living in this region. They're also important for the Indian economy. India is the biggest receiver of remittances in the world. In 2022, Indian workers overseas sent some $111 billion back to India. The Gulf countries contributed the biggest share. Countries like Kuwait are completely run by an Indian workforce. 4.2 million people live in Kuwait. Indians make up 21% of the country's population and nearly 30% of Kuwait's workforce. Clearly, these workers are an asset, not just for the Gulf nations, but also for India and its economy. It is time for New Delhi to do more to support them. The stage is set, the leaders are here, the meetings have begun. The G7 summit is officially underway here in Italy. This is the 50th G7 summit. It is happening in southern Italy. The leaders are staying in a secluded oasis, a luxury resort called Borgo Egnazia. It is located in Apulia and it's really far from everything. So who's going to be there? The G7 is a group of 7 nations that were once the biggest economies in the world. That's the United States, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, Canada and the UK. They make up the G7. So you could say it's a club of rich countries. Their leaders are all here. Then there are the other guests. This list is at the discretion of the host country. They can invite whoever they want to. Usually it's just a handful of leaders, but this year Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni of Italy has gone all out. She's invited leaders from more than 11 countries, including Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He will address the G7 outreach session tomorrow. The Prime Minister says that he remains committed to consolidate the India-Italy strategic partnership. The other invitees include Ukrainian President Zelensky, Brazilian President Lula da Silva, Jordan's King Abdullah II, Argentinian President Javier Milei, Saudi Crown Prince MBS, and Pope Francis. It's the first time that a Pope will attend a G7 summit, so the guest list is quite long and diverse. And that means that there's a lot on the agenda. The discussions start with Africa. It's a top focus at the summit, for the host country especially. Several African leaders will be present here, and it's the perfect opportunity for Giorgia Meloni to engage with them. Africa is critical for Italy as it tries to control illegal immigration. Prime Minister Meloni has been working closely with African leaders on this. She's been traveling frequently to the continent. In the month of March, Meloni visited Egypt. In April, she was in Tunisia. And now in June, she's hosting African leaders and pushing for what's called the Mattei Plan. Here's what it's about. Meloni wants to position Italy as an energy hub between Europe and Africa. She wants to invest in the continent, boost growth in Africa, which may in turn help curb immigration. It's an ambitious plan, but Meloni is hoping that she can get the backing of the G7 for it. Second on the agenda is the Gaza war. Israel's war will dominate most conversations here, but the G7 may not do very much about it. So expect words, not action. They've already backed the US drafted peace plan, and that's all that they want to do for now. The other war will get precedence here, and that is the war in Ukraine. The summit has 2 sessions dedicated to this war. President Zelensky has been pushing for more Western aid. But I don't think he'll have to really ask here, because it seems that the G7 has already agreed to lend Ukraine $50 billion. This money will come from Russian assets. As we've been telling you, the Russian central bank has assets both in Russia and outside. It has money held in banks and financial institutions outside Russia. Now, when the war with Ukraine broke out, the West froze those Russian assets. They were immobilized. Moscow could no longer access them. But the point is that this money still belongs to Russia. The West cannot touch it. What they can do is use the profits generated by these assets. And they want to use this money to aid Ukraine. There will also be discussions on migration, economic security, and even artificial intelligence. A final statement will come on Saturday, but it won't be binding. It's more like a guide, an indication of how the group thinks. But does it even matter? Is the G7 still significant? You see, the Group of 7 was founded in 1975. Back then, it was a group of the world's 7 biggest economies. They made up for 70% of the world's GDP. So it was the group with the deepest pockets. Russia joined it in 1998, and it became the G8. But that was short-lived because Moscow was thrown out in 2014 after the invasion of Crimea. So they were back to G7 in 2014. Now, for long, it was like the cool table in the school cafeteria. It's where everyone wanted to sit. But things have changed in the last decade. The significance of the G7 has waned. Right now, it makes up for 40% of the global GDP and only 10% of the global population, which is not very good representation. Plus, they have competition from other groups like the Brics and G20. Both of them represent more countries and bigger economies. So is the G7 still the big economic club that it claims to be? Or is it just a relic of the past? It's something for the group to think about as they meet over the next 2 days. A lot of issues will be discussed during this G7 summit, and one of the major topics would be China. The West has a number of issues with Beijing, and it seems that they have finally decided to take a stand. It's not just some simple rebuke this time. The West seems to have launched a multi-dimensional attack on China, on the Chinese economy and their diplomatic aggression, basically just short of an actual physical confrontation. A number of attacks, in fact, have been launched back-to-back. Let's start with the EU's move.
The Commission has also pre-disclosed today the level of provisional countervailing duties it would impose on imports of battery electric vehicles from China.
The European Union is imposing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. These tariffs will range from about 17% to a whopping 38%. Major Chinese companies will face these tariffs like BYD, SAIC, Geely and others. Chinese EVs had been gaining ground in the European Union. In 2019, their market share was just 1%, but now it's closer to 8%. The reason for this growth was the cheap prices. Chinese EVs typically cost 20% less than the European ones. So the EU has decided to nullify China's price advantage. As you can imagine, Beijing is not happy about this.
What I want to emphasize is that this anti-subsidy investigation is a typical case of protectionism. China will take all necessary measures to firmly safeguard its legitimate rights and interests.
Beijing has issued a warning. The EU tariffs could start a chain reaction, possibly a trade war, but the Europeans will have support from their biggest backer, and that is the United States of America. Washington had announced a similar tariff hike last month. US tariffs on Chinese EVs were increased to 100%. So Europe still lags behind. But it's a clear signal that the West is united in its opposition to China. So that was one battlefront, Chinese electric vehicles. The next one is advanced computer chips. The US has been fighting a chip war with China since 2022. It has been trying to restrict Beijing's access to advanced chips, like the ones used to power artificial intelligence technology. It seems the US is planning to up the ante. It is planning a new round of restrictions, not just on American-made chips, but also on chips made using American technology. There's a technology called Gate-All-Around, or GAA. It is used to improve chip performance and reduce power consumption. And this technology is patented. So the US wants to block the exports of anything made using this tech. It would be another blow to China's chip sector, marking an escalation in the US-China chip war, and that is the second prong of the Western attack, advanced computer chips. The third prong is less direct. It involves sanctions against Russia. The US is planning more sanctions, and this time Chinese firms will become collateral damage. The US believes that China is helping Russia evade sanctions. It says Chinese firms are sending microchips, drone parts and weapon components to Russia. So a few dozen Chinese firms were sanctioned yesterday. This won't stop the evasion though, but it does send a message. Biden is sanctioning China on the eve of the G7 summit. He will want the EU to follow suit. And if Europe joins in on the sanctions, Beijing will have to deal with another battlefront. So EVs, chips and sanctions. These are the West's economic targets. But the US and Canada have begun a diplomatic assault as well. After decades, they're reviving the issue of Tibet. Yesterday, the US Congress passed a bill. It urges Beijing to re-engage with the Dalai Lama to find a resolution to the China-Tibet dispute. The American bill comes on the heels of a Canadian one. The Canadian Parliament passed a motion on Monday. They unanimously supported the Tibetan people's right to self-determination. Both these acts are symbolic. Canada and the US cannot force China to free Tibet, but bringing up the issue could make China uncomfortable and throw some light on Beijing's imperialistic behavior. And that is another attack. The fourth in a few days. It shows that the West is trying to corner Beijing to apply pressure. But will it work? Will Beijing back down amid a multi-pronged attack? I guess we'll have to wait and see. One of the key issues at the G7 will be Russia. A lot of people thought that Giorgia Meloni would be soft on Putin, but she has turned out to be a staunch Western ally. Just ahead of this summit, Italy unveiled a new military package for Ukraine. But here in Bari, the sentiment is mixed. And a big reason for that is Santa Claus. Not the one that you're thinking about. This is a 4th century saint who inspired the modern day Santa Claus. His remains are buried right here in a basilica in Bari, and right next to it is a gift from Vladimir Putin. How is Bari coming to terms with this contrasting reality? How is Bari related to Russia and Putin? Our next report tells you. When I say Santa Claus, what is it that comes to your mind? Red dress? Long white beard, maybe a few reindeers. Well, that's the marketed version of it. The real Santa Claus is right here in Bari, and today we are heading to his place of burial. The calm Mediterranean Sea on one side, the old Bari town on the other. And nestled in between is this basilica. It is dedicated to Saint Nicholas, a Christian saint. The Santa Claus you know is based on him. Saint Nicholas was born in the 4th century in present-day Turkey. As a Christian saint, he became famous for secretly giving gifts, especially to poor children. That's how Saint Nicholas became Santa Claus. In this part of the world, in the Mediterranean, he is a very important religious figure. Thousands of Christians visit this basilica every day to offer prayers. Inside it are the remains of Saint Nicholas. Around 1,000 years back, Turkish sailors stole them from the home country and brought them here. And this has become an important religious symbol. The locals here love him. Saint Nicholas brings in a lot of tourists. He is also a global symbol for peace and forgiveness, sort of like an ambassador for Bari. Statues of Saint Nicholas are common here. So is the tradition of keeping his photo inside your wallet. The belief is Saint Nicholas is watching over you. So that's ambassador plus guardian angel. A lot of pressure for one saint. Now you can add politics to the mix. Christianity is said to have 3 main branches: Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox. The Catholic Church is very powerful in Italy. It is headed by the Pope in the Vatican. And the Orthodox? Most of them are in East European nations like Russia, Ukraine, and Bulgaria. Bari has been a meeting point for these branches. This basilica itself is a Roman Catholic institution. But Saint Nicholas is revered by the Orthodox Christians too. So once a week, his crypt is open to them. They can go in, do their own Orthodox rituals, and pay their respects. In 2007, one such Orthodox Christian from Russia visited Bari, Vladimir Putin. In Russia, Saint Nicholas is probably the most important saint. He is said to have rescued Russia multiple times from crises, which is why Putin came here. As president, he's built a close alliance with Russia's Orthodox Church. It's a symbiotic relationship. Putin backs the Orthodox Church, the Church offers him legitimacy. But 2007 wasn't Putin's first interaction with Bari. That happened many years ago. This is a Saint Nicholas statue right outside the basilica. And next to it you can see a plaque. It has gotten dark around the edges, it's an old one, but if you look closely you can still make out this is a letter of friendship and cooperation to the people of Bari. And here is a signature of Vladimir Putin. This is what it says, Vladimir Putin. The Russian president gifted this statue to the people of Bari in the year 2003, and with it he wrote a letter of friendship, which was then converted into a plaque. For years no one really cared about it, but now it has become a politically charged issue. Because Italy is firmly in Ukraine's corner in the war against Russia, and a lot of people think that if not the statue, at least this plaque signed by Putin should be removed. The chorus is quite strong. In 2022, a petition was drafted to remove the plaque. Around 12,000 locals signed it, but the town mayor said no. He says history cannot be cancelled.
Saint Nicholas is in our hearts. For us it is culture, on top of faith and religion. But Saint Nicholas is our patron saint, so it will never happen, that's for sure. I mean, we won't make it happen.
Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians have many differences, often bitter ones, but Bari stood as a symbol of hope. In 2017, the Pope announced a very important decision. He decided to send parts of Saint Nicholas's remains to Russia, specifically his ribs. You wouldn't believe the joy in Russia. Thousands queued up outside a church in Moscow. They waited hours to catch a glimpse of the relics.
An event like this does not happen every year or even every decade. When I left the church, I had a feeling that I wasn't walking on the ground, I was just floating. It was an amazing feeling. I feel very good and comfortable in my soul.
Putin too arrived at the church. He kissed the glass case holding the remains of Saint Nicholas. It was indeed a show of cooperation. But the war in Ukraine has changed it all. Not only has it pitted Roman Catholics against Orthodox Christians, it has also pitted Barisians against Barisians. This city has long been Italy's gateway to the East. As a result, a lot of East Europeans live here. Ukrainians, Russians, Slovenians and Bulgarians. They too are divided over the war. Some are silent on the invasion, others are vocal in condemning Vladimir Putin. It's a sad turn of events for a city that once stood for a lot more. We're talking about two power centers of Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church of Italy and the Orthodox Church of Russia. This city and this basilica gave hope of cooperation between these two power centers. In fact, the Pope allowed some of the remains of St. Nicholas to be taken to Russia in the last decade, sort of like a goodwill gesture. But now politics has interfered. Putin is no longer welcome in Bari or anywhere in Europe. Meanwhile, there's a buzz around here that Ukrainian President Zelensky may visit. Now, speaking of Russia, Moscow has made a power move on the other side of the world. Yesterday, some Russian ships arrived in Cuba. Russian warships. There was one guided missile frigate, the Admiral Gorshkov. It's the lead ship of an entire class of frigates, armed with Caliber cruise missiles, Zircon hypersonic missiles, and Onyx anti-ship missiles. It arrived in the Havana port yesterday, flanked by a tugboat and a fuel ship. So a Russian frigate, armed to the teeth, docked in Cuba, a country that the US has embargoed since 1958. You heard that right, 1958, 66 years. It is the longest trade embargo in modern history. So it's safe to say that Cuba and the US aren't on good terms, and now a Russian ship has docked in Havana. It's a signal from Putin that Russia can waltz into America's backyard anytime it wants to. And the frigate wasn't even the real message. Putin's big warning cruised in a little later, half submerged, Cuban and Russian naval flags fluttering in the wind, and a contingent of soldiers on the deck. It was a Russian nuclear-powered submarine, the Kazan. Cuba greeted the vessel with a cannon salute. The residents of Havana had lined up to get a glimpse of the ships, especially the submarine.
I saw it, a submarine, and I said, wow. And I took a picture. I have never seen a submarine in Havana in my life.
It impresses me a little because I have never seen something so close, such a large ship of that magnitude.
The Cubans were clearly impressed. But Putin isn't doing this to capture their attention. His target is a little to the north. Barely 160 kilometers away from Cuba, that is where Florida begins, which means that Putin has just sent his warships to America's doorstep. This comes weeks after an American provocation. The US recently gave Ukraine a green light. It allowed Kiev to use American weapons to strike Russian territory. Putin said that it was an escalation, and now he has responded by sending warships to Cuba. This has some Americans worried.
Hopefully this is not the beginning of something that could be unpleasant for humanity, because we are the ones in the middle. We are the ones who pay the highest price for the conflicts and disagreements that one group has with the other group, and in the end they stay safe, because they send war, and we are the ones who pay a high price.
Washington is trying to downplay this incident. They say this keeps happening, that Russia keeps sending ships to Cuba, which is partly true. But while Russian ships do keep going to Cuba, Moscow hasn't sent a submarine before. And this time, there's a nuclear-powered, nuclear-capable Russian submarine in Cuba. Washington says the submarine is not carrying nukes. Cuba was also quick to clarify this, which is to be expected, because this country has been in this situation before, at the frontier of a war between Washington and Moscow. I'm talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Back in 1962, Cuba was the site of a showdown between the Soviet Union and the US. The previous year, in 1961, the US had placed nuclear weapons in Italy and Turkey. It was a provocation, so the Soviet Union retaliated by preparing to place nukes in Cuba. In 1962, US spy planes captured the preparations. Washington could not have that, but they could not attack either. Instead, they decided to blockade Cuba. The Americans sent out their warships, but the Soviets blocked their path. So Soviet and American vessels were face to face, and the world was minutes away from an all-out nuclear war. Eventually, both sides backed off. That, in a nutshell, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba was about to be the flashpoint for a nuclear war. So this country has a symbolic importance, and now Putin has sent his warships to Havana again, including a nuclear-capable submarine, which is a loud warning to the US. Russia is telling them that its patience is running out. But will the US listen, or will it continue to egg Ukraine on? The G7 summit is a test for its leadership. Can they solve the world's biggest problems, or will they let them fester again? The success of this summit hinges on this question. And there's a reason why I say this. Some alternatives to the G7 are punching above their weight, like Brics, the group of leading emerging economies. This week, the foreign ministers of Brics nations met. They met in Russia. Indian diplomats attended the meeting. A joint statement was released. The Brics countries are sending a message to Israel on its Gaza offensive. They want Israel to stop the war. The Brics has condemned Israel's operations in Rafah. They're concerned about the increasing attacks, the growing death toll, and the humanitarian crisis due to the war. The Brics nations have slammed Israel for what they call a blatant disregard of international law. And they support full membership of Palestine at the United Nations. Moreover, the statement uses the term occupied, and this choice of words is significant because it paints Israel as the occupier. This is a sweeping criticism of Israel's war. More importantly, India has signed off on this statement. Along with the rest of the Brics members, India has signed, which is again quite significant because so far India had walked a fine line, balancing both the interests of Israel and Palestinians. When the Hamas attacked Israel, New Delhi called it a terrorist attack. But in the same breath, India also backed the two-state solution. When the Hamas attacked Israel, New Delhi called it a terrorist attack, but in the same breath, India backed the two-state solution where Israel and Palestine coexist. Just a few days ago, New Delhi had maintained the same balance while discussing the Israeli attacks on Rafah.
The heartbreaking loss of civilian lives in the displacement camp in Rafah is a matter of deep concern for us. We also note that the Israeli side has already accepted responsibility for it as a tragic incident.
But in Russia, India sided firmly with the Brics and endorsed the use of harsh language for Israel. Does this mean a shift in India's policy? Well, not exactly, but it does show how the developing world views Israel's war in Gaza. They want it to end soon. The Brics made progress on other fronts as well. They discussed using their native currencies for trade. They challenged protectionism in global trade, and they called for a reform of the World Trade Organization. Brics nations want special treatment for developing nations at the WTO. By raising these issues, the Brics is taking an aim at the West and challenging the G7, which is also interesting because barring Russia and China, the other original Brics members have all been invited to the G7 summit in Italy. South Africa will skip due to domestic reasons, but India and Brazil are attending. Nonetheless, Brics is carefully positioning itself. Last year, they surpassed the G7 in GDP. Its 5 original members, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, contributed more to the global GDP. This is on a purchasing power parity basis. This is a measure of economic productivity and living standards. Now, going by this report, the share of Brics nations stood at over 31%. What about the G7? The 5 Brics countries together contribute nearly 31.5% of the global GDP, compared to 30.7% by G7 countries. Their share was around 30%. Now this year the Brics has gotten bigger. It has added 5 new members, that is Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, Iran and Ethiopia. This newly expanded Brics represents over 3.5 billion people, and their combined economies are worth more than $28 trillion, which is about 28% of the world's economy. These numbers challenge the economic influence and positioning of the G7. It doesn't represent a large section of the world's population, and it's not being able to solve major global issues. Take the pandemic, for instance. The G7 promised to deliver 1 billion shots to the world. Instead, they kept most of the vaccines for themselves. They did not share the supply. This hoarding may have led to deaths. At least 600,000 lives could have been saved had the vaccines come on time. The G7 has failed to deliver on climate change as well. It promised to provide $100 billion per year for the world's transition away from carbon fuels. So far, they haven't paid up. Now they seem to be heading towards another failure. Recently, the G7 leaders endorsed Biden's truce plan for Gaza, but it has failed to gain traction. The efforts of Brics leaders, though, are getting attention. The Palestinians have welcomed the Brics statement on the Gaza war. That was to be expected, of course. One of their diplomats has thanked the Brics and India for taking a stand against Israel. So here's where we are at. The G7 are neither the richest nor the most influential, which again is a point to ponder for the leadership. Cryptocurrency was a big topic at last year's G7 summit, and this year, barely a mention of it. Crypto's fall has been as rapid as its rise. Today, Bitcoin prices are rising, but the dreams of using it as a currency have been dashed. Here in Bari, we found evidence of it. This city has 2 Bitcoin ATMs. Both were opened with much fanfare during the pandemic, but both are largely unused right now. So we decided to find these elusive Bitcoin ATMs to understand what Italy's crypto scene looks like. Here's a report. Today we are searching for an ATM. Before you ask, doesn't this stuff happen when the camera is off? Hold on. This isn't just any ATM. This one is designated for cryptocurrencies. There are thousands of crypto ATMs in the world, but most of them are located in the United States, the headquarters of all dubious ideas. Bari doesn't fit that bill. This is not a haven for tech bros or eccentric billionaires. Why then does Bari have not one but 2 crypto ATMs? Not sure if I should say expected or unexpected. The first Bitcoin ATM was set up in 2020 at a financial center, but later it was moved to this location, a cannabis store. Now, cannabis is not legal for recreational use in this country, but holding or possessing it is not illegal either. And that is the tricky thing about cryptocurrency. People use it to buy things that they cannot buy with cash, maybe drugs or other illegal items. Let's head inside and find out. Nothing much to say here. It's a cannabis store in southern Italy. Everything here is cannabis themed, from clothes to pouches to more discreet items. But on the billing table, you see this small machine, an ATM to buy Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Normally, an ATM connects to your bank account. This one doesn't. It connects to your digital crypto wallet. Now, there are 2 important numbers to note here. One is your digital crypto wallet, which is a bit like your bank account. The second is your private key, which you enter to transfer or buy crypto. And this machine has certain limits. A minimum of 20 euros per day and a maximum of 1,995 euros per day. So you put in your cash, you enter your private key, and the machine does the rest. It converts your money into crypto. Let's talk rules now. The European Union does regulate cryptocurrencies. They have a set of laws called MiCA, Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation. It covers consumer protection, asset classification, and market abuse. Italy too has updated its cryptocurrency rules. It is perfectly legal to buy and sell cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin in Italy. There is only one condition. You must go via registered crypto markets or agencies. This ATM is operated by a Lithuanian crypto service. It's called Crypto Local ATM. I'm sure they bought into the crypto craze of the pandemic, but as you can see, it's not exactly buzzing with people. The shopkeeper says the ATM is rarely used. They accept Bitcoin on their website, but not for direct sales. Plus, people are worried about being scammed. No worries though. There's another crypto ATM in Bari. Maybe we'll have better luck there. This one is definitely bigger than the first. You can't miss the big black board that screams Bitcoin. Inside, things get interesting. The ATM machine is placed inside something that can only be described as a cage. Iron bars separate you from the outside. On the screen is the prevailing Bitcoin rate, a whopping 62,000 euros. After multiple crashes in the last few years, Bitcoin is rising again. Bari has around 13 businesses that accept Bitcoin. Rome has more than 120 such businesses. Some Italian giants tried using it as a method of payment. Like Ferrari, the legendary Italian car maker started accepting Bitcoin last year, but payments remain extremely rare. The problem doesn't seem to be acceptance. Around 8% Italians say that they have bought some sort of cryptocurrency. The problem seems to be usage and reliability. Cryptocurrencies are too volatile to be used for daily transactions. You must be tech savvy to buy, sell or exchange crypto. A lot of people thought that cryptocurrency is the next big thing, but that bubble has been burst. There have been a lot of crypto scams in the US, and even here in Italy, these ATMs are on the radar of the financial watchdogs for money laundering. ATMs like these are an easy way to convert your black money into Bitcoin or any other kind of cryptocurrency. And we told you about the mafia problem in this part of Italy yesterday. So a free laundering service is the last thing that they need. What about investments? A lot of people buy Bitcoin as an asset, not as a currency. Well, there's tax on that. Italy has slapped a 26% tax on the gains made from cryptocurrency. So Bari's crypto problem is much like the world's. The pandemic triggered a lot of interest, which led to rapid crypto growth. In Bari's case, 2 ATMs in no time. But then came a dose of reality. Even in the small corner of Italy, the crypto bubble is bursting. Now let's turn our attention to Pakistan, South Asia's most fiscally irresponsible nation. That's not an easy title to win, but Pakistan does it year after year. One way or another, Islamabad finds a way to go bust. Then they run to China, the Gulf nations, or the International Monetary Fund, asking for a bailout. How does this keep happening year after year? Because the Pakistani government keeps blowing away money on its bloated military. And this year it's no different. Pakistan just released its new budget, and it has increased its military expenditure by a whopping 17.6%.
2.1 trillion rupees will be provided for defense expenditure, 839 billion rupees for civil administration, 1,014 billion rupees will be provided for pension expenditures, and 1,363 billion rupees will be allocated as subsidy on electricity, gas and other sectors.
That was Pakistan's Finance Minister, Mohammad Aurangzeb. He presented Pakistan's budget yesterday. Amid a chorus of boos from opposition lawmakers, he said the Pakistani military will be getting more than 2.1 trillion Pakistani rupees this year, which is about $6.15 billion US. It's an increase of more than 17%. Last year, the military got about 1.8 trillion Pakistani rupees. Pakistan is in an economic rut. Listen to the Finance Minister again.
For the fiscal year 2024-25, there is an expected 3.6% economic growth target. Inflation is projected at 12%.
He's expecting low growth and high inflation. The country is negotiating a loan with the IMF. They want an extended fund facility worth $6 to $8 billion. To get this IMF deal, Pakistan is preparing to squeeze its taxpayers dry. They want revenue collection to be increased by 40%, which is a tall ask and impossible without bleeding the average citizen. Amid this bleak outlook, Pakistan is planning to increase military spending by more than 17%. So obviously, the move will draw criticism. Islamabad knows this, so it has tried to cover its tracks. The budget itself is absurd. Pakistan's government is showing an overall expenditure increase of 30%. That is about $15 billion more than last year. It's unrealistic for a country that is struggling financially, but Pakistan has declared this in its budget. And because of the inflated numbers, the Pakistani military share seems small. The 17% increase is hidden amid the bloated expense figure. Then there are other accounting tricks. Pakistan's military budget does not include military pensions. The pension amount is 662 billion rupees. That is more than $2 billion US. But this won't come out of the military budget. A different government department will pay military pensions in Pakistan. Similar accounting tricks have been used for major military purchases, like nuclear development. That funding comes from a different source, not the military budget. Pakistan does this intentionally to hide the real amount of military spending from its citizens. Now you may wonder, why is the Pakistan government doing this? Why is it lying to its citizens, taxing them dry, all to feed its bloated military? Well, you must understand that Pakistan is not some normal country with an army. It's a military establishment that masquerades as a country. The Pakistani army controls all the strings, including the purse strings. It will keep taking a lion's share of the budget and hiding its true expenses from the public while squeezing them dry. That's the only thing the people of Pakistan should expect from this and every other budget it sees. Now let's talk about NEET, National Eligibility Cum Entrance Test. So NEET, N-E-E-T. It's the only entrance exam for undergraduate medical courses in India. So if you want to get into a medical college, you will have to appear for it. Every year, hundreds of thousands of students appear for this test, and it's quite difficult to crack. But this year, it got even tougher for the students. There have been allegations of paper leak, unfair marking, and grace marks being awarded without consideration. It has led to an uproar across India. And the agency conducting the test is under fire. So what is this fiasco about? And what will happen to the 2.4 million students who appeared for this exam in 2024? Our next report tells you.
May 5th was an important day for 2.4 million students here in India. It was the day of the NEET, the National Eligibility Cum Entrance Test. For aspiring medical students in the country, this is the be-all and end-all. This is the test they must crack if they want to become a doctor here in India. Now, the pattern of the test is quite simple. There are 200 MCQs, that's multiple choice questions. Candidates need to answer 180 of them. The total marks for the entire test is 720. Candidates need to answer 180 of them. The total marks for the test is 720. So that is the highest score you can get. Correct answers get you 4 marks. If an answer is wrong, a mark is deducted. Unanswered questions don't impact the score. But if you choose multiple answers, marks are deducted. Which brings us to the controversy. 67 students got the perfect score, that's 720 marks. Out of these, 8 students were from the same exam center. So that raised suspicion. A few of them even got marks like 718 or 719. So questions were raised over that as well. Plus, there were allegations of a paper leak. In Rajasthan, students were apparently given the paper with pre-marked answers. But that's not all. Then there was the issue of grace marks. It was awarded to 1,563 students. This was for the loss of time due to multiple reasons. This became another point of contention. The controversy grew so big that the matter reached the Supreme Court. Students filed petitions against the NTA, that's the National Testing Agency. It's the body that conducts this exam. They sought the cancellation of the exam on grounds of question paper leaks and other malpractices. Today, the top court heard the matter. It has led to the scrapping of the grace marks awarded by the NTA. The centre said the process was wrong, and it now leaves the 1,563 students with 2 choices. They can either retake the test or forego the compensatory grace marks they got and get a new ranking. But the entire controversy has raised a few questions. This is one of the biggest medical exams in the country. It's an exam that determines the fate of millions. So why can't the process be more transparent? Many questioned why the exam can't be held online like other engineering exams in India. Technology could lead to more transparency in the process. Either way, this controversy has raised questions over the integrity of the NEET, and it's unlikely to die down even with a retest.
Now coming back to the G7 summit, with diplomacy on the menu, the leaders will have plenty on their plates, quite literally. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is seizing this opportunity to showcase the dining prowess of Italy. The menu is a gastronomical journey from the south of Italy to the north. There are some classics like lasagna and lobster risotto. Then there are unusual combinations like tomato-flavored ice cream. This is an opportunity for Italy to showcase its cultural richness and pair it with not only its famous wine, but also inclusivity. After all, leaders from more than 18 nations will be attending this summit. Over the years, food has played a powerful role in diplomacy. So how have other G7 hosts fared? Have some leaders chosen the menu in bad taste? Here's a report.
The G7 summit is officially underway. Leaders from several nations will spend the next few days in Italy's Apulia. This includes the G7, of course, or the group of 7 nations. That's the US, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, Canada, and the UK. And along with them, there will be guests from over 11 countries. There's a lot on the agenda. It's expected that world leaders will be negotiating difficult situations, working long hours, and spending a lot of time talking to people. In short, it's going to get busy. But no matter what, like anyone else, the leaders will have to eat. And like most diplomatic get-togethers across centuries, food is going to play a crucial role at this summit. Which is why Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is going all out with gastro-diplomacy. So what's on the menu? A journey to Italy. It begins from the south, with crunchy bread and gold leaf from Campania, fish soup from the Adriatic, blue lobster risotto and bergamo from Calabria, and tomato ice cream for dessert. To most of us, it sounds unusual, but this ice cream is a hit in Italy. Over the next few days, the menu will shift with flavors from the north of Italy. The star of the show is the crunchy pot of lasagna. The signature dish is exactly what the name suggests, with slightly overcooked corners of the lasagna. Then there's a little finger tortellino from Modena. Some may say what holds the menu together is bread. A lot of attention is being paid to it. And a lot of room has been created for meat as well. It has directly been sourced from Piedmont. This menu, offering food in Italy's favorite green, white and red colors, has been designed by Massimo Bottura, a top Italian chef who has been awarded 7 Michelin stars. Bottura is clearly being experimental, because the combinations proposed for the G7 summit are not exactly classic. The food will be served with some of Italy's best wines. Some Italian sommeliers may turn up their noses on the pairings, but these wines are loved by foreigners. After all, gastro-diplomacy is complicated business. The menu must focus on conveying Italian values. It should represent the country's biodiversity and cultural richness, along with a side of inclusivity. After all, leaders and politicians from across the world will have a go at it. For instance, at the G7 summit last year in Japan, leaders were treated to a belt-expanding tour. The menu showcased the best of Japanese dining, including Japanese oysters, Hida beef, and sea urchins. But Japan didn't always get it right. In 1992, when then US President George Bush visited Japan, he was offered raw salmon with caviar. He then made history by becoming the first sitting president to vomit on the Prime Minister of Japan. When it comes to food diplomacy, the stakes are always high. Clearly, Italy has a lot on its plate.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. While the G7 summit is underway here in Italy, lawmakers brawl in the parliament over reforms. In the US, a person rafts down flooded roads in Florida amid torrential rains. In Colorado, a rescue team frees a dog trapped for 3 hours in a house vent. And finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in the year 1900, the Boxer Rebellion began in China. The Boxers were a resistance group. Their primary aim was to evict all the Europeans from China, but their real motive was to occupy parts of China to establish a German colony. We're leaving you on that note. Thanks for watching. We will see you tomorrow.
Music has the power to heal people. It gives them strength to deal with their pain. The chords can help one in zoning out miseries. You must have heard about the power of music. But a small town in the West African nation of Ivory Coast is a living example of it. Away from the hustle and bustle of Abidjan city, the northern rural town of Odienne is grooming budding musicians. These children between the ages of 6 and 16 use music to shape their lives. Around 140 children of Odienne have formed an orchestra. Odienne relies heavily on agriculture, sometimes involving child labor. The childhood of these youngsters is often lost to poverty and the uncertainty of high unemployment. But in the middle of all this, a bus takes them away from their realities to the joyous world of music. These children gather once a week, but every day a few youngsters gather to practice. The music sessions have given 9-year-old Leila Koulibaly a way of leading her life.
I want to be a professional musician because the orchestra changed my life. There's nothing here. The orchestra is important for us. It helps us to organize ourselves well, to tolerate each other and be disciplined.
While 15-year-old Siaka Sai Savan uses his music lessons to forget about the exhaustion that comes from helping his mother in the market and his brother in the field.
In the morning, at midday, and in the evenings when I get home from school, I don't have lessons in the evening, so I come to help my mom. After that, on Saturdays and weekends, I go to the field. And now, in the evening, when I go to the orchestra, I eat a lot before going to the orchestra. I take my time to wash up. I do all that before going to the orchestra and meeting up with my friends to play.
The economic woes are not the only hurdle. They also have to fight conservative parents, especially in predominantly Muslim areas where music is not considered a fit for followers of Islam. Given the situation and the hopes that the orchestra brings to these children, the group's instructor believes it's a crazy project.
In fact, we're doing the opposite of what a traditional orchestra does. That is to say, at a traditional orchestra is a gathering of all the best musicians who have passed competitions, who have got their diploma, etc. Here, the Odienne Orchestra started by bringing them together as an orchestra, and that's where they learn about instruments, playing technique, music theory, and so on.
La technique de jeu, le solfège, la musique et tout.
While being taught to tune their instruments, these children also learn to tune in the chords of their lives. The orchestra has given them hopes of a better future and encourages them to fight the harsh realities to chase their ambitions.
From impeachments to inaugurations, if it's a political story, we are on the scene. The race for the White House is heating up.
We're beating Biden.
How dare he say that?
If it's breaking news, we're live with the latest coverage. From the White House, the State Department, and Capitol Hill. We know the issues, but above all, we know the players to bring you the latest in-depth analysis on all the key stories that we're covering. I'm Eric Ham. Join me from Washington here on Firstpost America.